What do you mean you don't agree with me? Do you know who you're dealing with?
Good day, YouTube. I am pleased to make your acquaintance. My presence may be ascribed to the general putrefaction occurring within the right wing of politics, in a facet of communist infiltration, resulting in a far more odious veneer for us all. I was latterly left apoplectic in this matter by the fallacious, or perchance purely uninformed, comment besmirching liberalism as somehow preternatural to Anglo-Celtic society, and that we must return to our roots. This is inherently nebulous. In what regard is it now somehow a noxious force which is now smothering its host? Such host, spasmodically convulsing, in some decrepit wheelchair of the nursing home has been relegated to. This is utter drivel. His full espousal, and it's now killing us, we must return to our roots, can thence be discerned as an either misconstrued or deliberately disingenuous assertion. To preface, I believe myself to be that of a minarchist, part of the true right wing, the Libertarians. All those who claim to be of the same affiliation, yet promulgate statism and greater authority, are but left-wingers, with the likes of the Republicans and Democrats situated within the centre. I must divulge that I find communism anathema. Such an appellation demarcates fascism and National Socialism within its bounds. Upon the latter I presume this fellow to belong to, by virtue of the general Volkist, Volk and Volk, the same root word, so essentially race socialism, which expounds upon the necessity of a true socialist state, unfettered by the trammels of antisocial elements. This, however, is a most foolish supposition, of most odious character, and one which retards any germ of a good idea or economic development. The Reich, in debt by 2 billion Reichsmarks annually, thus forcing it to invade Poland, temporarily abated with the seizure of approximately 1.5 billion RM from the Jewish. Anyway, pardon my tangent, but this is obvious, demonstrable evidence of both A, that Nazism literally sucks. Don't know why you would have the temerity to deign other economic systems which, actually function, to deign it obsolete, that is, and or deleterious, and that B, this ideology merely gives us a bad name to the centrist majority. By the by, this cretin obviously doesn't have the ardour to research his own beliefs as of the repugnant machinations of the Nazis for Britain, such entailing the enslavement of all males and use of women as genetic material, which has as of late been publicised, and which is also corroborated by historian and journalist William L. Schurer, who was actually in Nazi Germany at the time of the Second World War. I beg of you, please stop stating, Germany is Peak Europa, bro, or some wanker shit like that. You sound like a dolt on a numpty. Notwithstanding that, I believe it imperative to propagate the truth, the veracious truth, about the actual Anglo-Celtic perceptions. By the way, I am in no means a historian, I merely mean this to be a riposte, based on sundry but scant pieces of evidence, and that this is more so a polemic or treatise than a true thesis, for I haven't enough time to dedicate to this endeavour. I shall also, for the sake of convenience, omit this person's allegiance, and treat this as a general libertarian treatise. As for my biases, I am both Anglo-Celtic and middle class, so be warned from whence this is derived is such. To commence, we must transfix ourselves upon the root, much as the terse reply dictates. What is special about the Anglo-Celtic people? Capitalism. Capitalism is both what made the Britons affluent and what gives us the sense of purpose and morality, which is concomitant with our presence. We are inextricably connected to this marvellous system predicated upon rational thought. Hence, we must look to the drudgery and bestialism of the Middle Ages for our answer to this matter.
What the fuck is a polemic?
The foremost eminent expression of the Anglo proclivity for liberty is that of the aptly named Charter of Liberties. Therein, as the name insinuates, such theoretically ensure the basic rights which would be extended to the English earls. The charter was signed in 1093 by a moribund Henry I, fourth son of King William the Bastard, later conqueror. This, a vain attempt to mollify the hitherto rancorous nobility. Other than that, I needn't go further into detail upon the circumstances from which this originates. Anyhow, upon his convalescence, the charter was generally abnegated from, as you do, and that concluded that epoch. Notwithstanding its fugacious existence, it nonetheless serves to further the argument that the true British state is one where individual liberties are protected and bargained for. The first point, warranting mention, is point 4 upon the rights of widowed aristocratic women. She should be allowed to remarry according to her wishes, so long as she remains the integrity of her body in a lawful manner. From this we may surmise the dedication of Britons to a general parity of rights, this an idiosyncratic principle within this period of time. The Celts and Anglo-Saxons have always been more so equanimous on liberty, regardless of one's characteristics. Discrimination and sexism nonetheless persisted, but at the least, women in the Anglo-Saxon period did retain the capacity to own their own property, rather than being precluded from inheritance or possession. It doesn't exculpate the Britons fully, for they still did act in rather sexist manners, however, a modicum less than others comparatively. In a different vein, point 8 follows thus. If any of my barons commit a crime, he shall not bind himself to the crown with payment as was done in the time of my father and brother, but shall stand for the crime as was custom and law before the time of my father, and make amends as are appropriate. Anyone guilty of treachery or other heinous crime shall make proper amends. Now this is indicative of a desire for egalitarianism in the space of law and general representation legally, such derogating corruption and venal clemency from the king. Not necessarily a libertarian per se, however this is nonetheless a facet of paleoliberal principle. Point 11 adopts a radical shift in content. Those knights who render military service and horses shall not be required to give grain or other farm goods to me. Herein lies the matter with this quotation. It represents definitive proof of the British desire for both a limitation on the state's appropriation and the refutation of feudalism. Upon the former, libertarians accept that the state is akin to a parasite, retarding growth and vitiating the pecuniary health of the populace, and world by extent. Hence, redolent of any parasite, it must feed. It suckles off the voluptuous tea of trade and productivity. Hence, it comes naturally that as of the absence of productive capacity, as the government just simply shift money from one sector to another, whilst bereft of all foresight and the use of price signals, which are necessary to any functioning enterprise, government expropriation must be limited, or else the people will befall ruinous consequences. Furthermore, the feudal system is predicated on the technological constraints of the period, a system where the king is sole proprietor of all land, hence no one but the king owns anything. Consequently, as of the incapacity at the time for the king to administer all his titles, such are to be consigned upon vassals, plots of land called fiefs which are tenanted in exchange for rent, be it taxation or levies, in exchange for said fiefs being given to vassals. Hence, this is a complete repudiation of such a system. After all, how may the knights, after paying the taxes, not be subject to further expropriation if they merely squat on the king's land? Hence, from the beginning, we exhibited a unique economic system and social system based upon property. In practice, however, this was relatively mercurial. Anyhow, the Charter of Liberties serves as a portent of what is to come, and is of impressive lucidity to the natural order as described by Locke, a mere 500 years after the Anglo-Saxons were civilized by the Catholic Church in 597 AD. The story of how they found out about Britain is a rather intriguing one in itself, which I may go further on in another video. But for all this talk of liberty, it was far from a great charter.
No, 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 no! Wait!
The Magna Carta is of most import to understanding the propensities of the British people. Unlike the Charter of Liberties, such actually confers rights upon the common man, rather than merely the earls. The impetus behind the presentation of this charter was the desire for peace. A state of acrimony had been bred between the earls and King John after his inane endeavours in France against Philip II. These an attempt at revanchist reconquest of the prior Angevin holdings within France. The matter of financing such exorbitant matters, of course, fell upon the lords, who were taxed strenuously. Further expropriation likewise loomed of these pugnacious endeavours, with the suit for peace resulting in a demand for recompense to the French following the ruinous Battle of Bavines, 27th of July, 1214. This the conclusive stage of the 1213 to 14 Anglo-Franco War. For the sake of brevity, and my personal sanity, we shall only speak upon the immediate background matters which influenced this. The Great Charter was drawn up by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, in an effort to mollify the Lords. The Lords, of course, desiring the affirmation by King John of his commitment to upholding the Charter of Liberties. Magna Carta, signed 15th June 1215, would later be forsaken by the king, such only to his detriment, however, with the kingdom then being embroiled in the First Barons' War as a result of such. Now, upon the matter therein, the title reading thus: To all men of our kingdom, we have also granted, for us and our heirs forever, all the liberties written out below, to have and to keep for them and their heirs of us and our heirs. The use of the term liberties immediately conveying the subject matter, and that this pertains, indeed, to a state of freedom, the dictionary definition of liberty, the state of being free within society from oppressive restrictions imposed by authority on one's ways of life, behaviour, or political views. To all free men of our kingdom, likewise a note. Whilst one must acknowledge that indeed feudalism existed within Europe, and by extension Britain, whilst this charter directly pertains to the barons as well, it does however extend to those not within indentured servitude, that including a good proportion of the peasantry. I know not the number, however free peasants did very often exist, and merchants, as well as many craftsmen who tenanted cities and boroughs. Hence, this extends past oligopolistic standards. Furthermore, many such points pertain directly to trade and commerce. Point 35. There shall be standard measures of wine, ale, and corn, the London quarter, throughout the kingdom. There shall also be a standard with dyed cloth, russet, and haberject, namely 2 ells with selvages. Weights are to be standardized similarly. And point 41, all merchants may enter or leave England unharmed and without fear, and may stay or travel within it by land or water for purposes of trade, free from all legal exactions in accordance with ancient and lawful customs. This, however, does not apply in time of war to merchants from a country that is at war with us. Any such merchants found in our country at the outbreak of war shall be detained without injury to their persons or property, until we, or our Chief Justice, have discovered how our own merchants are being treated in the country at war with us. If our own merchants are safe, they shall be safe too. Hence we are elucidated to the emphasis that the Britons place upon trade, the desire to standardise measurements being included in such a conciliatory treaty, indicative of this. Likewise, the commitment to unmolested commerce, with stipulations upon the treatment of merchants within periods of war, and their immunity to arbitrary expropriation, evident of this. Hence, why we invariably witness an inclination to free trade expressed by the British, particularly within the Victorian period of Pax Britannica. This is an inveterate trait inherent to the Anglo-Saxon people. Likewise, there follows a trend of legal precedent, that of independence from unjust persecution or arrest upon nebulous grounds, with protection of one's property likewise included. Point 39. No man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed, or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any way, nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals, or by the law of the land. And, additionally, point 20, that, for a trivial offence, a man shall be fined only in proportion to the degree of his offence, and for a serious offence correspondingly, but not so heavily as to deprive him of his livelihood. Upon the latter, such is indicative of a sense of justice which is predicated upon property. Rather than some eccentric punishment, such as mutilation, or even that of capital punishment, the offender is to be laden with compensatory payments which they hold in their remit, rather as equivalent to the value of the offence, and thereby the value of property which has been exposed to usufruct or pilfered. An acceptance of capital is expressed within this document by its points upon usury and property inheritance. Dues utilised as a category as such as of their general participation in banking by virtue of the deprivation of land that they were beset by. However, of note is that they are mentioned, and that they are too insured by this charter under provisions surrounding debt. Point 11 stipulating, if a man dies owing money to Jews, his wife may have her dower and pay nothing towards the debt from it. If he leaves children that are underage, their needs may also be provided for on a scale appropriate to the size of his holding of lands. The debt is to be paid out of the residue, reserving the service due to his feudal lords. Debts owed to persons other than Jews are to be dealt with similarly, residue being the remaining money after debt has been paid. Hence, the debt remains. However, some provisions are dispensed, this typifying the general Anglo-capitalist system. Minor government intercession for the betterment of the populace, however generally allowing the capitalist system to flow uninhibited. Please note the last line, debts owed to persons other than Jews are to be dealt with similarly. By no means am I saying that the British were angels in any capacity or exceptionally clement to the Jewish in any way, however they nonetheless acknowledge their natural rights in this regard to financial exchange, rather than in many regions where they would be employed furtively, and then dispatched of when the time was right, that generally being when their use had expired, and arrears began to accumulate. Additionally, there are the points upon the use of appropriation, point 30 and 31 stating, no sheriff, royal official, or other person shall take horses or carts for transport from any free man without his consent, and neither we nor any royal official will take wood for our castle or for any other purpose without the consent of the owner. The implications here are self-evident, with each individual an agent of their own will, and so on with their property which may not be impinged upon. Of scarce interest are some points upon niche matters which nonetheless serve to further the British sense of liberty, and which serve to illustrate Faustian spirit within the Britons, that being the desideration of progress even at the detriment of tradition. Point 56 on the former. If we have deprived or dispossessed any Welshman of land, liberties, or anything else in England or in Wales, without the lawful judgment of their equals, these are at once to be returned to them. And point 47 on the latter. All forests that have been created in our reign shall at once be disafforested. Riverbanks that have been enclosed in our reign shall be treated similarly. Therefore, we may conclude that the route to which Britons are fixed is that of liberty and capital. The British contriving both capitalism, Adam Smith particularly influential in this regard, and liberalism under John Locke. John Locke particularly piquant upon his conception of man. This is an extension of the British philosophy of existence, under which all further is predicated. Men being, as has been said, by nature, all free, equal, and independent. No one can be put out of this estate and subjected to the political power of another without his own consent. Chapter 8, Section 95 of the second treatise of the two treatises on government. Moreover, we may bear witness to the sense of property as immutable within his writings, as follows thus. Whatsoever, then, he removes out of the state that nature hath provided, and left it in, he hath mixed his labour with, and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. It being by him removed from the common state nature hath placed it in, it hath by this labour something annexed to it, that excludes the common right of other men. For this labour being the unquestionable property of the labourer, no man but he can have a right to what that is once joined to, and at least where there is enough and as good left in common for others. Of course, this doesn't preclude the capitalist system's feature of the capitalist class, which rather provides their time and capital in exchange for labour, and hence that is a fair transaction, rather than, as the communists claim, essentially pilfering, essentially robbery. Thus, we may see our true beginnings were those which we embraced within the Victorian period, and throughout, generally, those which we now woefully forsake. Now that we have witnessed the intrinsic beliefs of the Britons, we may now endeavour on a cursory venture as to why they are so auspicious as opposed to pernicious as alleged. We may, for this salutary exercise, merely look upon France, hitherto the Revolution, the denizens of that land, beset by a torpor of subsistence, which inhabits all those bereft of the individualism which the Britons embrace. Quote, it was notorious, and the lament of agrarian improvers, that all French peasants seemed to care about was producing enough grain to feed their own families. Their ambitions seldom went beyond having just enough grain to feed their own families. This, according to the Oxford History of the French Revolution by William Doyle. Following remark on page 14 is made. The quotation derived from a British sojourner travelling France. All the country girls, noted Arthur Young in Queercy, are without shoes or stockings, and the ploughmen at their work have neither sabots nor stockings to their feet. This is a poverty that strikes at the root of national prosperity. It reminded me of the misery of Ireland. A bit too contumelious on Ireland, if I may say, this considering that the Celtic part of France, Brittany, ostensibly maintained the most developed road network, and among Alsace-Lorraine was one of the first French areas to adopt modern agriculture in accordance with the agricultural revolution, albeit Ireland was at the time a colony, so perchance the remark is fair. I shall for but a moment provide a graph for you, a praise upon British economic development from the Middle Ages to 1915. Note the general stagnation in GDP per capita, hitherto the 1600s, when free trade and capitalism really began to expand. Therefore, we may conclude that Britain has been availed by its penchant for capitalism, liberalism, socialism, as opposed to the more collectivist tendencies of the continental masses. I pray this oral treatise was pleasant to watch. It is my first, after all. If there is any erroneous information, feel free to comment any corrections. Likewise, I encourage free discourse within the comments, and may partake in some colloquy with you. My sincere apologies about the breadth of information. I sought to belt this out as a riposte to a rather vexatious supposition, and a general trend within the right as a whole towards socialism. Please leave any feedback, if you wish, on how I may ameliorate future treatises, if you wish, of course. I may or may not create a subsequent edition entailing coverage of the later years, such as the Victorian or Enlightenment periods, albeit those would be of far greater personal travail on my part to research. Much obliged to you for listening, and farewell.